Okay, Robert?
Robert would like to know that, so if Cain is a reference to the biblical story, did Irving really find the Bible to be all hocus pocus? Or was it more of a description of the world as real history or the real human experience?
Do you want me to answer that? I'm the one who said hocus pocus. Well, okay. I think he thought the Bible was one of the great works of literature and history of all time. The hocus pocus had to do with the traditions, the Jewish rituals. That's the hocus pocus that I was referring to. You know, my father, for example, in his will, demanded that he be cremated, not buried. He knew perfectly well he was defying Jewish tradition by wanting to be cremated, which he was.
I would just add that the stories and the tropes from the Bible show up in quite a number of his poems, and they're strong and they're powerful. But his acquaintance with, say, the Hebrew Bible was probably by reading the traditional King James Version.
Oh yeah.
Not reading the original and knowing what the great commentary, the great commentaries like Rashi's were there. I don't think that was part of the picture, but they do crop up and show up in his poems. Hocus Pocus, I never heard in many years that I talked to him. He just felt that, well, I would say echoing behind his response to Jewish ritual, to the following of mitzvot and stuff like that. To him, this was all echoed in the phrase he heard when he was young, when he went to the socialist cafe Horns, religion is the opiate of the people by Karl Marx. And that was something that was ingrained in him and many of the people of his generation who fled from anything to do with observant religion that they watched their parents follow. It was to be their grandchildren who were going to go back and see that it was not just simple hocus pocus, that some of these rituals actually were what I would like to say is a kind of shaping of experience, the way rhyme and meter shape a poem. But for him, this was, it was alien to him. I don't think he observed it. And I know I didn't read a poem about going into a synagogue. When he was in Florida one time, he went into a synagogue and he found it wanting. It was too nice. It was too big. It was too bourgeois. He wanted, like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, he wanted to hear thunderous speech by the rabbi. And he found everything to be part of that whole middle-class culture, which he stayed away from and satirized in many of his poems.
Right. Yeah, my word hocus pocus is probably a bit too strong, but I think you said it really well. He would have thought of it as the opium of the masses.
Yeah. I see a hand up there. And I'm not the one who can recognize you, but our technical team can.
Go ahead, Vivian.
Thank you. Am I talking? Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this. This is really quite remarkable and wonderful. So thank you. I have two questions. One, was your father's native language, was it Romanian or was it Hungarian? I know that's a crazy question, but.
It was Yiddish.
He spoke Yiddish.
His mother tongue would have been Yiddish. And Yiddish would be the language spoken in the home by his mother, father. The fact that he becomes a really, really good English poet is an amazing thing because it's not his mother tongue. He must have learned English in school.
And the second question, the second question is, where can I get a copy of the book that you're using with his poems? I am just, do you, yeah.
Well, if you want his selected poems, they're still available. You get onto whatever way, Amazon, whatever. His
I think the
selected
title
poems.
is A Wild Peculiar Joy.
Joy, yes, there's a new edition that's available. You can also go to secondhand book dealers on go say the A Books, and there are many secondhand copies of his earlier selecteds, whatever, at very reasonable prices. Everything else seems to be inflating. Canadian poetry seems to be deflationary right now. You can pick up fantastic books all throughout. I have to tell you a funny story. In his latter years, when he was at the Maimonides retirement home in Montreal, I came once with a group of students. Second time, we were going to film him as part of Don Winkler's film. And I remember the first time I brought my students, and it was a sunny May day. And they said, Mr. Layton is outside with his caregiver, a lovely Polish woman who unfortunately died too young. And they were sitting there in the sun, and he had his head bent forward, and she was sitting there reading. And I wanted to get his attention, so I called him by his Yiddish name. I said, Yeshua ben Moshe, was machst du? He woke up out of nowhere and smiled at me and answered me in Yiddish. So he loved answering. He had a limited vocabulary, but he loved going back to the Yiddish, and it was something very much ingrained in him.
Yeah. I have a funny little story. You're talking about the devaluation of Canadian poetry, but some of my father's books ended up being worth quite a lot of money. I mean, the very early ones. And my father would hand me a book when a new book would be published. And he'd say, hold on to this, son. It's going to be worth a lot of money someday. And, the price on the book would say, maybe $1, $1.50. That would be the sales price of these very early books. And, a couple of them ended up being worth $5,000, which isn't bad for a book of poetry. That's the funny story. They really did end up being worth some money.
Sorry.
He used to tell the students that when I first time I met him when I was in grade 7, Mrs. Lewis's class, they brought him to kind of entice us to go to the New Herzliya. And I think he pulled out some books of his and sold them to us for $1 each. And one of my lectures years later to my own students, I said, buying some books of poetry can be a better investment than buying mutual funds. I said, I bought 2 books by Irving Layton, each by $1 each. And now they're worth, I think 1,800 one, and that was 20 years ago, 1,800 one and 1,600 the other. I said, if I had bought, 1 share in the Royal Bank of Canada, general, I don't know what, equity fund, I don't think it grew as fast as the value of his books, But I still think the later books, if you want to buy a book, it's not difficult to buy them today, good copies. I really, poetry, as I say, is just not selling at inflated prices. It's a good time to build your collection.
When I was a boy living in a farmhouse in Côte St. Luc, there was a weird little sort of channel that went under the eaves behind the actual rooms of the house. And you could go through this channel from the bedroom that my sister and I shared into my parents' bedroom, kind of a back way, which was how, when my mother sent me to my room as a punishment, I would simply crawl through that, open the window of my parents' bedroom, go down the roof of the porch, jump onto a willow tree, and be gone for several hours. And they'd never know I wasn't sitting in my room. But in order to do that, I had to maneuver around boxes and boxes of my father's books, which were sitting there, The Blue Propeller and various other books that just had never sold. And if you had a box of those books today, they'd be worth a good amount of money. But of course, they got trashed, I'm sure. Anyway, A Wild Peculiar Joy is the name of the selected poems. McClellan and Stewart is the publisher.
We will be putting up all the poems that were read today and the books as well on our website, on the Limmud Ottawa website. And of course, this is being recorded, so the recording will be available for anybody to reach or to gain access just by going into our website. And again, it's limmud.ottawa.ca, very simple, and anybody has access to it.
So here, I'll do a little book selling. Here is the cover of the book that's in print. Not much of this is in print new, but here it is. I think it's still in print. Selected Poems, A Wild Peculiar Joy. You can get it direct from any book dealer will get it for you from the publisher.
I see we have some more questions. Is there a chat question?
There's Bernhard Katz there. I know he always has good questions.
Right, but we have Elliot and Eva Newman who are waiting patiently
Okay.
to ask their question. They're queued up there on the top. So go ahead, Elliot and Eva, unmute yourself and ask your question. Your hand isn't up? Your hand is up? Yeah, so you have to unmute to hear you. Maybe.
Unmute.
Unmute.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Got it. Okay. First of all, Max, pleasure to see you now. This meeting is about 6 decades late. You and I went to West Hill together.
Oh my
I was
God.
I was a year ahead of you, and we both had our eye on the beautiful, dark, sultry Vera.
Oh, wow.
And I really liked you. I was impressed by you, Max. You had a lot of verve and spark. But beyond that, a few years later, I was in a poetry workshop with your dad at Concordia in the fall of '66, where there were actually some notable poets coming out of that shop, like Michael Harris, Tom Ezzy, a number of other people who, published a fair bit. And I became very friendly with Irving. I became his coach at a Folkways recording of his poems down at a studio on St. Antoine Street.
Yeah.
He drove us down safely to the studio, my wife and I here. And this would have been back in '67 or beginning of '68. The album was produced by Alan Feynman. We were sitting beside Aviva, and he's about to recite the Fertile Muck. And Aviva, I know you're here today, Aviva, sweetly said the Myrtile Fuck, and just broke us apart. And it was very hard to keep a straight face while Irving was trying in the glass booth, trying to recite his poetry. We, as I said, became famous. I'm kind of a second cousin of Leonard Cohen, and received more news of Leonard Cohen from Irving than I ever did from my family. And I believe that Cohen proposed marriage to Aviva by way of buying her a wedding ring because she wanted one. And there were many, many wonderful moments that I had with Irving. And I want to point out that there's being religious, and then there's being spiritual. And to me, he was archly spiritual. And I think that was largely left out of this entire program. And that to me is an essence of poetry and of the poet. That is what elevates mankind to this lofty position that only poetry can do. And I'm going to quote Per Lagerkvist: the purpose of the poet is to praise the lofty purity of the human spirit. So Irving was one of my favorite and most preferred teachers, very important in my life. I consider him the Dionysian inspiration of my creative spark, if there is one. And I had another professor who was the Apollonian inspiration. So I came out of it all balanced, not confused. And my wife and I happened to be in Toronto. It would have been in the '70s. And he had, I believe, he was no longer with Aviva. I had visited them in Spadina Village, and this was now history. And he had a little flat in, where was it, Forest Hill or for something or other. And the morning after the Seder, and he had made a Seder, a Passover Seder at his place. And so the morning after, he made breakfast for Chav and me. and recited us poetry. Of course, he had no more use for me. He was reciting love poetry to my wife and told us tons of anecdotes. Was a marvelous, vast individual. And I remember we lived on Melrose, and your residence was on Wilson and Summerled. He would walk past our house to his studio apartment at the corner of Melrose and Côte St. Luc. This is just about a block away from his home. And I'd see him walking by before I had the guts to go up and say hi to him before I knew him. This magnificent, charismatic, energetic man, going to his studio to spend hours alone and supposedly write poetry. And then I would take the number 63 or 66 bus down to Concordia, and sometimes in the same bus with him before I knew him. And he was always reading, and he used to tell us, steep yourselves in poetry. You know, if you want to write poetry, steep yourselves in it. And the next thing was craft your poems. Don't just jot something down and, you know, throw it on the table in our class, craft them. And so he was exigent. You know, he really demanded a certain level of perfection, I suppose. But he also, if we didn't come up to the level of writing great poetry, he nevertheless respected us, treated us with great friendship and great generosity. So I wanted to pass that on to you, Max. It's been too late in coming.
Well, listen, you made, thank you, first of all, and nice to see you again after all these years.
Sure.
But you make an excellent point, very excellent point. Yeah, my father was profoundly religious in his attitude towards the creation, towards all things. That's part of what Seymour was talking about, his love of the little creatures and his sympathy for them. So his attitude was one of reverence and awe at creation. And in that sense, he was a profoundly religious man himself, except when he killed a frog. And
Yes, but when he
and
killed
talking
the
about
frog,
his technique, talking about his concern there. I mean, if you actually look carefully at that poem for his mother, Cana, you realize the first three lines, there's a rhyme pattern in the poem, you know, A, B, 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 C. It's very, very conscious. And the first three lines are in perfect hexameter. There's 3 feet for every line. And the fourth line is 7 feet, which is very hard to do, by the way, a 7-foot length of line. And to do it again at the beginning of the third verse and at the end of the third verse, and then at the very last line of the poem. So the whole poem is this symmetrically balanced, technical work of genius. I mean,
Yeah, I agree with you.
Unbelievably hard. I mean, Shakespeare's sonnets are in iambic pentameter, 5 feet. This poem is in 6 feet, you know, and then 7 feet.
I think he's following a specific form in that poem. It's familiar to me. I mean, I tried writing one or two, but I think the form exists. And he was amazing at that. He could, again, craft his poetry, which a lot of people don't bother with.
Well, if you look at the other poem, Cain, every line is 10 syllables. Every line, 10 syllables, until you get to the part about, oh, Egypt, marbled Greece, resplendent Rome. Suddenly it all expands out into hexameter and heptameter. And because that's the sort of large statement that he's making at the end of the poem. But he's able to do, I mean, it's all under his control is the point. Craftsmanship.
As great as we think he is, I think he was highly underrated still.
No question. No question. I just wanted to say we have a lot of questions coming up now from the audience.
Thank you.
And in line, I see from Beersheba, we have Mark Elliot Shapiro. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
First of all, I want to say hello to my friend Seymour. You're doing a very nice job. And Max, you'll be interested to know that I think my father and your father sort of grew up in the same neighborhood in Montreal. And also my father became pro-Zionist in the 1960s. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
About the poem, Cain, I think there is, perhaps between the lines, there are allusions to Egypt and the plagues. The frogs were one of the 10 plagues.
Right.
And it's very interesting that you said that a good part of the poem is 10 syllables, which could also be sort of an unconscious reference to the 10 plagues. And the idea of your father killing a frog might be, in a way, part of an expression of his antagonistic attitude towards Judaism at a certain point.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. When I said, who is the frog in this poem? And that's what I meant, just what you said just now.
It was nice talking to you.
You too.
Very nice conference.
Thank you.
Welcome from Israel.
Yeah, and thanks to Seymour and Jenny and everyone else involved. Alexandra did a fantastic job.
Zvi, I hope we'll have hummus together the next year.
Yeah.
Okay, well, come to Israel.
And bring back some hummus when you do it.
Yeah, I don't think it'll last unless I have a refrigerated little bag, Max. I think you'll have to come with me in person.
You're both welcome to come to Beersheba and to any part in Israel.
Yeah,
I once, sorry, just throwing it in there. I bought a Montreal smoked meat sandwich for my mother. I bought it from Ben's in Montreal, and I took it on a Greyhound bus for 3 days and 4 nights all the way to California where she lived. And I handed her the bag with the smoked meat sandwich in it. Her partner at the time said, "Oh, beef never goes bad," and chumped it down immediately. Although it was green. And
oh wow.
And he was sick for several days after that.
Wow.
Oh, there's something there to watch there. It's a parable with a meaning. So we'll have to go. And besides, in any case, no, not Beersheba. I'll meet you in Tel Aviv at Shuk Carmel if you want to have hummus. Or
absolutely. No problem.
All right.
And Max, you're also invited.
Oh, toda rabah.
Thank you. So again, we actually had set up some breakout rooms to continue with these conversations and questions. I see that we have quite a few people still waiting to ask. I'm going to ask our technical advisor, what do you say we continue in this format, or do we break out in break rooms?
Well, if people are still asking questions and then willing to do it, let's keep the questions and answers short, and then people can go in the breakout rooms later if our main guests are okay with that.
Are you both okay, Seymour and Max?
Yeah, I'll be happy.
We're now going about 10 minutes to 4, so we can actually continue to 4 o'clock. So
well, you remember I told you last week when we got together to plan everything, I said we may have to stay here till midnight.
I'll try and keep my answers short.
Bernard Katz is next. He's waiting there. Go on, Bernard. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. And hello, Seymour.
Hello, Bernie. I know.
Max.
This is the way we meet friends today, by Zoom. That's what it is.
That's right. Takeazoi. So I don't know you, Max, but thank you very much. You read to my ears and mine very much like your father read. My question has to do with a relationship between Irving Layton and Leonard Cohen. With respect particularly to their Jewish poems. So in Cohen's Spice Box of the Earth, for example, which was an early publication of his, while he was still a poet in every respect, there are two poems that remind me of Irving Layton's Jewish poems. One, I'm not sure of the title, but the first line is, "For you, I will be a ghetto Jew." And the second, sorry?
The poem is called The Genius.
The Genius, that's
Yes.
right. I remember that now. And the second poem, and I'm not sure if he's addressing Irving or another person in the family. I think it's called Kina or Kina Lazarovich. And I missed the first little bit of this Limmud get together. And you may have referred to that poem.
I read it, yeah.
But did you read Irving's poem, or did you read Layton? Sorry, did you read?
I read my father's poem.
Okay, so there is a poem by Cohen in Spice Box of the Earth where he is addressing, I think, your father, because he refers to him as Lazarovich.
Yeah, it's called The Last Dance at the Four Penny. Layton, you know good Romanian. Who cares whether the Messiah is a Litvak or not? That I can quote you from the poem. It's a wonderfully amusing poem, and it's supposed to have taken place at the gallery that the Leonard and his friends set up on Stanley Street before it burned down.
With my mother's paintings in it, by the way.
2/3 of your mother's life's work went up in smoke.
That's
and
right.
It's a very amusing poem. Turning to Irving as if they were two Hasidim doing a dance together. But some of the lines are really great. Like the one, good Romanian, who cares whether the Messiah is a Litvak or not, is a wonderfully funny line. Absolutely. But in one of his interviews later in his life, Leonard said that the high point of his life, and sometimes he could be very perceptive. He said, my best book was The Spice Box of Earth. It's been downhill ever since. That's what he said. I didn't say it. Because the book has a wonderful elan and sparkle to it. And there are many poems with very obvious Jewish subjects. There was no, but then Leonard read Hebrew, and Leonard had a bar mitzvah, and Leonard followed it through later on in his life. When he moved back from Buddhist practice, he actually joined the Jewish Renewal Synagogue in Los
California.
Angeles, where he took his grandchildren every Friday. So,
I saw Leonard being interviewed once, and his knowledge, it was for a Jewish magazine, and he got asked some really, really detailed, tough questions about Judaism, and I was staggered by the amount of his knowledge. I mean, he was quoting from the Talmud and various other sources, which he knew, obviously, and he was doing this without anything in front of him, just off the top of his head. It was incredible. But the relationship between my father and Leonard, goes back to when I'm 10 years old. Leonard would come to parties at that little farmhouse that I was talking about, bring his guitar. And I would, there was a weird way that the building was constructed. So there was a staircase that came down from the second floor from my bedroom. And, but there was a slit in the wall. And so although I'd be sent up to the bedroom for the party, I could actually sneak down the stairs, and right at the corner of that slit, I could see down into the living room. And I can remember very clearly, it's one of my favorite memories, Leonard Cohen coming into the room, into the party. And it was like a magnet being surrounded by iron filings. They just, people, the women, but even the guys, everyone, the whole room just closed in around him, encircled him. He was that kind of a magnetic, interesting young man. And I'm happy to say he taught me how to play guitar. And I saw many interactions between him and my father that were all amazing. So, I could go on forever, but I know there's other people with questions.
Any comments, Seymour, about the relationship poet to poet from about those two?
No, they obviously they call it karma, call it chemistry, and they hit it off together because Leonard actually was closer to Louis Dudek for a number of years, but then when he met Irving, they really got together. They just hit it off. There was no doubt about it. Now Irving was always, I know over the years, sometimes perturbed, not perturbed, questioning. You know, when Leonard turned towards the more public sphere of songwriting, Irving was a little worried that somewhere or other he would give up on his poetry. But it turned out that a number of his songs were as intense and as complex as his poetry. And
Yeah, yeah.
Irving could go along and accepted it, whereas Louis Dudek didn't. And of course, the great fault line in the Montreal English language community from the late 50s to the 60s until, I think, the French nationalist cause kind of overshadowed everything, was the split between Louis Dudek and Irving. And I know I'm not trying to make a parallel in actual term, but it was like between Stalin and Trotsky. Everything just split. Everybody split in two. And for me, I was a student of Louis Dudek's, but on Wednesday night, I used to go and listen in to Irving's class. And when I wrote a bunch of poems, I gave them to Louis and he would shred them to pieces, pointing out what I could learn. And then because I was a masochist and an apprentice, I would take them to Irving. Irving would shred them a different way. And if I came out with, if I came out with 3 or 4 lines that were, acceptable to both, I thought I had joined the Parthenon, because their standards were enormously, enormously high. But they really were different in a key way. Leonard was a wanderer through most of his life, and Irving was still set wherever he was. He went on his trips, but he was more rooted. And then I remember one time Irving saying, I spent my whole life leaving, St. Elizabeth Street to get into NDG Côte St. Luc. And what does Leonard do? He goes from Westmount down to Marianne. He went the other way. Here, I'm trying to escape the poverty, whatever. He goes back there, and Irving found it enormously amusing. And then, of course, there was that the thing that Leonard said to him once. No, I think it was either Leonard said or Irving. I never remember it, but I think one of them said to the other, well, Leonard said, to Irving, I'll teach you how to dress. Oh, yeah. And Irving said, and I will teach you to live forever.
Yeah, that's a Leonard line.
Yeah, it is a Leonard line.
I also just like to throw in something that, people probably don't know. Everybody knows some of the aspects of their relationship, but I personally witnessed my father and Leonard sitting in the living room of the apartment we lived in on Summerled. Elliot, you'll know that one. And my father would reach up to the bookcase, which was right behind him in his leather seat, and he'd pull out a book of poetry and he'd say, well, Leonard, how about we crack a poem? And then he'd open the book more or less at random, and they would go through the poem line by line, discussing it together. What did it mean? What was the rhythm? What was the rhyme scheme, et cetera, et cetera.
Just like two Talmudists, except instead of the Talmud, they were looking at poetry.
Yeah.
Yes,
so
that's lovely.
They didn't do Bava Metzia, they did Shelley's poetry.
There's something else I wanted to say as a now long retired librarian at the University of Guelph, but I was, for the last several years of my employment there, the head of their archival and special collections. So I know a fair amount about rare books and so on. And I just wanted to say, with regard to what was a subject of the discussion not that long ago about the value of Irving's books, he and McClelland and Stewart, and when I say McClelland and Stewart, I am sure it was Jack McClelland that was involved in this. They came out with some limited editions of special books. For example, there is a large format limited edition of love poems by Irving Layton. You know, limited, I don't remember whether it was 250 copies or 500 copies. And the usual thing, you know, that Irving signed a certain number of them and so on. And in fact, I do have one of those copies, but not the first ones that were printed on vellum or whatever, you know. But he did get into that, and I don't know if it was a kind of money-making scheme.
It was.
Aha, okay.
Listen, I can tell you all about it because I'm the guy who published it. At the time I was working for McClellan and Stewart, I ran a subsidiary of theirs, and the subsidiary produced that kind of a limited edition. And it was one of my great acts of love for my father to do the love poems in an edition which sold for $1,000 per copy. And it was leather bound. Well, I personally went down to this place and I selected the leather for those covers. And I found a defrocked monk who actually knew how to engrave leather and do binding by hand. I selected the paper. It was all kinds of things being put into that book of poetry. There were only 30 copies, if I remember, for $1,000 each, but it was a money-making idea. But at the same time, very much a work of love from me, because it took me months to do it, to create those books. And then there was a cheaper edition. I think they sold for $100 a copy, and there were several hundred of those, if I remember.
Then, you know, up to the time McClellan Stewart published Irving's first collected, The Red Carpet for the Sun, which became, you know, a national bestseller. Most of his books came out as small editions by small houses like Contact Press or First Statement Press, and most of the poets were published in small editions. For example, I used to subscribe to Contact Press. I still have, you know, Peggy Atwood's first book, The Circle Game, was published only 200 copies. So I have to tell you a funny story. When I was at McGill, across the road, there was a bookstore run by a German Jewish bookseller who had fled Hitler, Mr. Heinemann, and he basically sold the libraries. And I used to come in sometimes and say, talk to him, and we'd chat. And I'd go to the shelves and look at the small little bit of Canadiana. And sometimes an interesting little book would come and I'd see if I could afford it. And there was one of Irving's books from the 50s, and I pulled it out and I said, oh, look, I don't think I have this. I opened it, I said, oh, but it's not signed. And Mr. Heinemann, who had a kind of a certain look in his eye, he was a elfish look. He said to me in this kind of English German accent, you know, an unsigned copy of Mr. Layton is even more valuable. Because, you know, the poets were signing almost all the books of their small editions.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me just, we are running soon out of time. And I just wanted to go one more question that we got in from our chat. We don't want to neglect anybody. So Leona, could you read the question?
So Rona would like to know, did Irving return to Judaic practice later in life?
Unmute yourself.
Max,
Unmute
you're
yourself.
muted.
You're muted.
Unmute.
Who muted me? Somebody muted me. How'd that happen?
A leprechaun.
What? So the answer is no. He, in his will, he wanted to be cremated, like I said earlier, and not buried. He did not want that ceremony, which was done by his trustees and not by me, where he was put in a coffin and carried out of a synagogue. Actually, in reality, what happened is they carried him out of the synagogue. The coffin was put in a hearse. The hearse drove around the block and came right back in through the back door where my father was cremated. That's what actually happened. He wanted nothing at all to do, and he never changed his mind about his Jewish beliefs.
I'm just going to go now to Walter Handelman. Unmute yourself. Thank you for waiting patiently.
very patiently, but worth every moment of it. I want to thank both gentlemen, but particularly Max, for sharing very intimate stories of your upbringing with a remarkably bombastic and incredible man. I was in Herzliya High School from 1950 to 1952.
Oh boy.
On what street?
Esplanade.
Esplanade Street. I blocked it. I just wondered, because at that time, this is an extension of Talmudtorah. It was his first attempt, so it was like junior high school today would be, grade 7 and 8. Sorry, grade 8 and 9. I went
Yeah.
8 and 9 because I went to Strathcona in grade 10. It was an extension of a religious teaching mainly for boys, although we had a number of girls in the class, and maybe some of those love poems were to those young women in the class, so I heard rumors. Did you ever hear that he was uncomfortable in that milieu? Because a lot of the teachers came from, quote, the old country, some via Winnipeg, and had very traditional, if I may use that word politely, views, and which I'm sure your father, Max, would not have agreed with. Yes.
Well, I mean, I don't know what his relationship was with his colleagues while he was there teaching, but I do know that when his book was published by McClellan and Stewart and received some publicity, the rabbi who was the head of Herzliya fired my father for the uncouth anti-religious things that he had to say. And my father wrote some poems to immortalize that guy for forever as the bastard that he was for firing him. And it was a very tough time for my father to find some money to support himself and the family.
Well, I should add that, Walter, in the 50s into the 60s, there were some teachers who could not teach in the regular school because of their political past. I don't know if you had Mr. Byers who taught math. Well, Mr. Byers was a member of the Communist Party of Canada up to a certain point. Even the Hebrew teachers like Chaim Brandwein, who later went on to teach at Brandeis, I remember him coming in to teach us Bible, and we asked him one day, did you go to yeshiva? He said, yes, I have a smicha. I said, what did you do with it? He said, I rolled it up, put it in the drawer, and I don't remember where I left it. So even the Hebrew teachers, even Mr. Magid, who was the principal of the school system, was very well read. He wasn't that observant. He was really a maskil, someone who really knew to be a teacher and devoted to the general Jewish learning. That began to shift by 59-60 when the community leaders, and I don't know who was head of the board, decided to make it a little bit more, say, bourgeois. That's why your father was fired and the school became far more religious under Rabbi Clark, I remember. And all the boys, if I don't remember if all, some of you are listening today, but we were encouraged to come early in the morning so that bring our tefillin and our talits and do shachrit in the morning, and we would get breakfast there. That started happening in the in the late 50s, because I graduated in 61. But there were many teachers there who taught who didn't have religious affiliation, but they taught because there was nowhere else for them to teach, and also they were paid poorly compared to the people teaching in the Protestant School Board, for example. So the board was able to keep the schools going because it cost a lot to run the high school with small classrooms. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
It seems to mute automatically, Max, so don't worry about it. I didn't do it. It's interesting. I realize that in the dates, if you were born in 1946, I think you said, Max.
Yeah.
So you would have been a 4 or 5-year-old and probably not aware or not yet aware of your father's diverse worlds, I would say, right?
Oh, at that age? No, absolutely not. He was just this strange guy.
Yeah. I have to say, to keep my comments as short as possible, that I wish I had had your father as a teacher later in life. His voice and his persona were so powerful that I think he cowed me. Not some of the others in the class who were intellectually more mature. I was intellectually less mature than many of my classmates. And I just wish that I had had him later in life where I could really have appreciated the scholastic. He used to throw out references to Greek mythology and all kinds of things. I had no clue, frankly. So in a way, I feel guilty, like most Jews feel guilty. His efforts on me were not as productive. Yes. So thank you very much, particularly both of you, and Seymour for bringing this to our world view, at least locally. I'm in Ottawa, Max, and particularly to you, Max, for sharing the intimate part of your home life.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Walter, you didn't do too badly. You were a distinguished colleague of mine at the University of Ottawa for decades, you know.
But certainly not in poetry.
I'm going to go now to Rhoda, who has her hand up, also patiently waiting, and we have two more. I don't know if we feel that it's too long, we can end it now. But this is just so intriguing. This is just positively mesmerizing. But go ahead, Rhoda.
Okay, my question pertains to his staying in Israel. I was wondering whether that experience affected his poetry. Did he write any particular poems about the state of Israel?
He has a whole book called The Whole Bloody Bird. You can get it out of the Ottawa Public Library. It has a diary in it, a bunch of essays, and a group of poems written of the direct experience of living in Israel in the, I think it was the winter into the spring of 1968. So there's a whole book.
There's a poem
Thank you.
about Jerusalem, which is one of his best poems.
That's
It's
a
one of the
later
poems.
one.
I wanted to read it, but
It's
they
a
wouldn't
later-
let me.
No. Well, we could do this. We could have a repeat session. You know, there's so many more poems I didn't read either.
I know.
Jerusalem
I'm
was
just
written-
joking.
Yeah, Jerusalem was written years later. That wasn't written in '68. The '68 book is a unique book because it's what the Japanese call a haibun. A haibun is a book which will have poems plus the record in prose of a poet's journey. So when the Buddhist poets would go up into the mountains of North Japan, they would keep notes and then they'd write their little haiku in between the prose, and it's called a haibun. I don't think Irving knew about the haibun then. I discovered the haibun later, but it's a kind of a haibun. It's a kind of a book which I think makes poetry that much more accessible because it's autobiographical. It's it's somewhere across between with poetry, journalism, articles, memoir. It's all mixed together, making for a very interesting reading. But
Very interesting. How do you spell that Japanese word?
Haibun in English. I won't paint the Japanese characters with my special brush simply because I don't know how to do it.
There you go. Rhoda, that's it. I'm going to
That's
go
it.
now to Ricky. Sorry.
Thank you, Jenny.
You're welcome.
Hi there. I'm an old friend of I'm an old friend of Sandra and Bill Goodwin. And subsequently, Irving became a friend as well. I was friendly with him in his latter years, and I would visit him often at Maimonides and play piano. And in any case, he gave me a book for My Neighbors in Hell.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And it says in it, I just don't know whether this is of any relevance or not, but I thought I would just share it. It says, for Ricky, one of my more attractive and inspiring neighbors, I guess he meant in hell. Best wishes, Irving Layton, Montreal, Quebec, December 2nd, 1980. I think it's 80 or 86. So I just wondered, so here's the book, you know the book, but I was just wondering, I have it, obviously keep it, but is there anything I should be doing with this book, or, it's just one of thousands?
That book was published in at least 1,000 copies. So
Okay,
his more
Mosaic.
valuable books were the small press books of the 50s. The books that came out of a Contact Press, First Statement Press, and one or two he published himself under, I forget the presses he gave to it. Those are the valuable ones, you know, right at the very beginning. Go to the Wikipedia entry on him, you'll see books starting from 1945. From 1945 to 1958, most of those books were published in between 200 to 400 copies each.
Yeah.
And they went to libraries, whatever, and a lot of them are hard to come by, and that's why they're book dealers, antiquarian book dealers, set a high price for them. But I think the prices are starting to come down a bit, because one thing I tell you about the millennials, they don't buy and collect poetry, so that has brought down the price of poetry. If so I think that was a good time to build your poetry library.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you. Is that
thank
it,
you for an
Ricky?
inspiring afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Extremely so. One more question left on the board. Acharon Chaviv, as they say. Haven Rachstein. Unmute yourself. There you go. Thank you.
Just I did. Just a couple of vignettes about Irving. I was in Herzliya between 52 and 56 or 57 when they actually created a grade 10 and 11 when I was grade 9 in the summer of, at the end of grade 9, they created 10 and 11. So I had Irving for 4 years in Herzliya.
Wow.
One of the vignettes is your father used to bring in books to sell.
Yes.
Obviously, the house was overloaded with books, so he used to bring in books to sell. In one of these episodes, we used to bid on these books, and we, those of us, or many of us, didn't want to look stupid, so we all bid. One of the guys who got it, and I'm not going to tell you his name, he was very prominent in Toronto, got one of the books and really didn't want it. So he sold it to somebody else in the class for twice the price. What happened subsequently, the next day we had a Latin exam, and Irving taught us Latin that year. And he got the guy up and just kept asking him questions until he was able to fail him.
Whoa.
He was so incensed at the fact that he bid for the book and then sold it for twice the price to somebody who wanted it.
Yeah.
He doesn't happen to
Another
be,
vignette,
this guy doesn't happen to be a media magnate, is he?
yeah. No.
No, okay.
Oh,
Another
it's not his name.
I remember when Irving won a fairly major prize. It was Rockefeller Foundation grant or something like that. I can't remember. He came into class that day and he said, I still remember his exact words, "Today I am a capitalist." So there are many of these vignettes that I remember. After all, he taught us, even one year, he taught us geometry, which he didn't know. He didn't know geometry at all, but he had taken it in high school, I guess. And he tried to teach us geometry because we lost our geometry teacher the first month of school. And those of us who were very good in math won a lot, or got a lot of his books, because he would not know how to solve some of the problems. And the way he would do things is he sent us up to the board to solve the problem for him. And if you solve the problem for him, you got a book. So many of us have all the early works of Layton.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, I have the Black Huntsman, all of the early ones, Cerberus, et cetera, all of his very early ones, all of them.
Wow. Very impressive.
Yeah.
And we have 2 more minutes left. And
Let me just add, Latin. He taught Latin. I'm
Oh, yeah.
amazed
Latin, that's right.
because there's the famous
Irving
story.
taught I think every subject except algebra.
Really?
I had Irving for. I had him for, as I say, geometry for 1 year.
Yeah.
Because, when he got kicked out of Baron Byng, both David Lewis and A.M. Klein tutored him, and Klein tutored him in Latin because Klein was a great Latinist. So I didn't think Latin was a strength of his, So the funny thing I should tell you, when he came back to Canada the year Klein died, and I had a symposium on at the University of Ottawa, I met him in Montreal. There's Irving, and we took a long walk from one of the Klein sons living in Outremont. I walked him all the way downtown Park Avenue, down to his hotel, and we came to the corner of Mount Royal and Park, and on the southwest corner, and there was a bench there, and he pulled me over the bench. He said, "You see that place? That's where Klein taught me Latin that year, and I had to get through." So I remember that bench. It may not be the bench, but that was the exact location. So
well, one of the stories that I have of how I disappointed my father, at the age of 4, he suddenly summoned me up to his office, which was in fact just a corner of his parents' bedroom, of my parents' bedroom in this little farmhouse that I was telling you about. And he sat me down at his desk and proceeded to teach me 10 words in Latin and 10 words in French. I believe he had read somewhere that John Stuart Mill had mastered Greek and Latin when they were only 4 years old, and he was convinced that his son could do exactly the same thing. He was wrong.
Anyway, 2 more minutes, we'll go, and then we'll have to close the session. But here we have for Sally, and then right after we'll have Linda, and that will be the end. Never the end, but for now, that will be the close. So Linda, unmute yourself. I'm just going to send you the unmute.
So who's talking? Sally?
No, I've
Oh.
unmuted. I'm Linda.
Who did I say first? We're doing this by the turn. Sally or Sally, go ahead. I think it was Sally who was there first. Am I right? I think so.
Well, let's
Anyway,
do Linda
so-
and Sally and then say new.
There
Oh,
you
okay.
go.
Well, that's up to you.
Okay, well, I'm Sally. Can you
Hi,
hear?
Sally.
Hi. You probably don't remember me, but I'm your cousin. I'm cousin Sally, and I think that we met in California when you came out after your mother passed away.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was a while ago.
Now, are you Harry's daughter?
I'm Harry's daughter.
Right,
Yeah.
I remember you. Yeah. Hi.
I'm so happy to see you now and to learn so much about my family I didn't know.
Oh.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to bring up a couple of things. I was in Turgut Niams. Turgut Niams is our parents' birth town in Romania. So I was in Turgut Niams a couple of years ago. And I arrived at a time when the local historian had just published his book, and he published a book about 4 famous people from that village. And one of them, of course, is your dad.
Oh.
Yeah, so I have a copy of the book. But, because I happened to come at that time, and I was his niece, they got a local newspaper man to interview me. So I was interviewed and asked, about my uncle. And among the things that I said about him, now I don't know if this is true. You have to tell me if this is true. But, the question of his relationship with Leonard Cohen came up. I mean, I brought it up. And I said that Leonard Cohen was Leonard Cohen because of Irving. He would not have been Leonard Cohen without Irving's influence. Is that somewhat?
I don't
correct?
really think that's true. I think Leonard really was one of a kind. I think he was, I think no matter what happened with my father, without my father, I think Leonard Cohen would have gone on to do absolutely extraordinary, unpredictable things. I think my father definitely was an influence on Leonard. I mean, for example, he has a song like a bird on a wire. Beautiful song, but what's the bird on the wire? Well, I think that's a line from my father's favorite poem of his own, you know, in the midst of my fever, the birds hopping on the blackened wires were instantly electrocuted. That's like a bird on a wire. So, I mean, I'm sure my father was an influence on him. I already talked about how they would talk about, they would open a book and actually dissect poems together. I'm sure Leonard learned from that more than my father learned from Leonard. But on the other hand, Leonard would certainly have insights of his own. I can remember them writing plays together. My father walking around the room, spouting out words for the play, while Leonard sat with a piece of lined note paper and his most amazingly beautiful handwriting, writing down the words, and then Leonard would interject something that he thought some character in the play should say, and my father would say, "Right, Leonard, very good, that's good," and then he'd keep going. You know, they had a beautiful relationship that went on from the time I was, like I said, about 10 years old until my father's death. Does that answer your question? I see I'm still on. What happened? Oh.
Anyway, I love when families meet together unexpectedly. It's ordained. It's predestined.
Nice to see you, Sally. We're on
Wonderful.
Facebook together, I think.
If we're not, I'm certainly going to see that we are.
Well, send me a friend request. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I will.
Okay.
Perfect. Linda, you're the last, not the least, but certainly to finish up our beautiful discussions here. Go ahead.
I just want to share I guess as having Irving as a teacher, it was at a private high school in Montreal on DeCarry Boulevard called Ross High School.
Right.
It was upstairs of Chalet Barbecue and next door to the Curb King. And I had him for 2 years. And I have to tell you, those are the fondest memories I have of high school.
Wow.
And this is the book I have, A Red Carpet for the Sun.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And every now and then I pick it up and I read it. And it's interesting. It was exam time and he came in and he said, exams are canceled today. And I said, oh, we all looked at him and he said, John Kennedy has just been shot.
Oh.
So it's really interesting, these memories one has. And as I'm listening to everybody, I now live in Ottawa, but as I'm listening to everyone with Leonard Cohen and all the names that, that you grew up with in Montreal, it's been a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful couple of hours of listening to everyone. And I want to thank you so much and everyone who put this together.
Thank you. You couldn't end us more beautifully.
The only my last comment would be, it's a pity that we don't have a good literary historian who would create a book. We have books for American literary circles. The Montreal from the 1920s till about the 60s, English Montreal, the literary world, never really had a comprehensive book that has kind of take us into the biographies and the relationships among the writers and the artists themselves, the painters. It's just a pity because it was an enormously fertile, productive period with, I still think to this day, perhaps the heyday or the apex of English Canadian literary creativity, especially in poetry. And we don't have that book. We have books about what happened in New York, in San Francisco, in Boston, London, of course, Edinburgh. We don't have the Book of Montreal. It's a pity nobody's come forward. We need a scholar who can write fine English to do that kind of a thing. And maybe it'll be done in the next generation. But it was a wonderful period. And Irving, of course, was one of the central figures in all that.
Absolutely. I hope this entire Zoom conference is going to end up on YouTube or something. So that
It's going to certainly be, it is being recorded. It'll end up on our website, and we'll see if we also put it on a YouTube channel one way or the other. But this is going to be open for anybody interested, and certainly all of us who participated in this extraordinary discussions. As I said at the start, we knew this was going to be a bit of history in the making, and we hope to return with more wonderful Jewish Canadian literature, and perhaps even a second part of this from Irving Layton. But I do need to thank our presenters, Seymour, Mayne. Seymour, without you, this would not have come together. Max Layton, the amazing inspiration in all your antidotes and just discussing and reading the poems from the heart. It was priceless. And to everybody out there who took the time and be here. I also wanted to mention that we are sending out a quick survey. This is to help Limmud Ottawa know what we should be doing to ameliorate the next Limmud event. So if you just take a small amount of time to answer and send it back to us, it'd be very much appreciated.
And can I have a postscript, Jenny?
Definitely.
That what we're planning, someone suggested, and we thought it was a good idea. This coming August will be the 50th anniversary of the passing of A.M. Klein. We thought after the one on Irving, maybe we'll do one on A.M. Klein in August or September of the coming. And I have my series called Shirat Sfonit, which is part of what Vered and Limmud are doing, an ongoing anthology of Jewish Canadian poetry. The first program was last March. I have 2 programs planned, one in the next month or 2 or 3 when our technical team recuperates, and then another one in the spring. And I just want, people are asking, my colleague Natalia Vesselova unfortunately is ill and couldn't join us. I know she's cheering us on, but get well fast, because I want you the next session, Natalia.
I see something here about schmooze rooms. We're not doing that, are we?
We just finished. No, we were supposed to, but it was too engaging conversations. We felt we did not want to break the momentum.
Yeah.
So we made our own schmooze room in the main event room.
I just want to thank Alexandra for his seamless technical work. And Jenny, thank you so much for emceeing this. And Seymour, thank you so much for thinking of me and inviting me to be part of it. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Yeah, and we went on for 2.5 hours, which is absolutely amazing.
I do want to thank the Vered Jewish Canadian Studies program at University of Ottawa for their support and for partnering with us once again for a fantastic event. We look forward to doing many more in the future. I hope everybody keeps well. Till next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.